In the summer of 1870, two of Europe's great powers collided with explosive force. By then, the impact between France and Prussia had been a long time coming. The traditional centre of continental power, France had been stagnating under the Second French Empire of Napoleon III. Prussia, meanwhile, had gone, under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, from upstart pipsqueak to iron behemoth. As Europe's centre of gravity shifted, a confrontation had become inevitable, but no one could have predicted just how transformative it would be. It was from the ashes of the Franco-Prussian War that Germany first emerged as a unified nation, that France permanently ended its love affair with kings and emperors, that Italian unification was completed. Yet the conflict also laid the groundwork for something far darker. The emperor captured, the capital besieged, the French were broken by a devastating peace treaty. Forced on Paris by Bismarck, it planted seeds of resentment that would, in the following century, blossom into two of the deadliest conflicts humanity has ever witnessed. Semi-obscure today, this is the story of the Franco-Prussian War, the war that forged Europe's destiny. The tale we're telling today isn't just one big military punch-up. Instead, think of it like a boxing match. The war itself is the primetime event, but to understand the stakes, you need to know the fighters, their backgrounds, their strengths, their motivations. So rather than leap straight into the ring, we're going to introduce you to our heavyweights. Starting over here in the corner colored, the deepest military blue is Prussia, one of Europe's 5 great powers alongside Britain, France, Austria, and Russia. Prussia was also the smallest and the newest. It had only been in the mid-18th century that it rose above its origins as just another small Germanic state. But new doesn't necessarily equal weak. Prussia had been there in the latter stages of the Napoleonic Wars, helping tear down the French Empire. In the peace that followed 1815, their fighting had been rewarded. Alongside Austria, Prussia had become one of the 2 poles of power in the German Confederation, a collection of 39 states born from the ashes of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet, this had almost been Prussia's undoing. By 1848, Germans had started being all like, hey, instead of being all weak and disunited, why don't we just Voltron together, all our tiny little countries, and become unstoppable, yes? The nationalist revolutions that swept the German states that year had seen delegates sent to Frankfurt to forge the statelets into a single German empire. With revolution at home, both Prussia and Austria had been seemingly helpless to stop this transformation. But in the end, the Frankfurt Parliament's dreams had been dashed. With order restored, the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, had declined the empire's crown, preferring to rule his state as an absolute monarch than all of Germany as a hamstrung emperor. The collapse of the 1848 revolutions ended talk of a unified Germany, but the idea didn't completely die, and when it resurfaced, it would come from a most unlikely source. Otto von Bismarck was the archetypal Prussian conservative, a gigantic bear of a man who loved his king almost as much as he loved swilling beer and firing pistols. For Bismarck, 1848 had been one long, non-stop heart attack, the liberal vision of the empire as unpalatable to his Prussian stomach as British cuisine. But by the time he was made Prussia's minister-president by Wilhelm I in 1862, he'd had a change of heart. Sensing where the tides of nationalism were taking Europe, Bismarck divined that a unified Germany might be inevitable. And the only way to stop it absorbing his beloved Prussia was to make sure Berlin became this new nation's de facto leader. And so began a brief period of Prussia goading other countries into war and then stomping the living out of them. There was the Second Schleswig War in 1864, in which Prussia and Austria teamed up to invade Denmark and annex the disputed duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Then there was the 7 Weeks' War of 1866, which saw Prussia turn its artillery guns on its erstwhile ally, leaving Vienna broken and humiliated. But while these wars were fought for different reasons, they all had the same objectives: to make Prussia stronger, to weaken Austria as a rival, to start unifying the scattered German states. In this sense, they were a spectacular success. After Bismarck shoved his gigantic iron boot up the Habsburgs' arses, Austria relinquished all of its claims to leadership over Germany. Prussia, meanwhile, gobbled up Vienna's allies, annexing Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, Frankfurt, and Hanover, along with the whole of Schleswig-Holstein. That done, Bismarck forced all of the remaining statelets north of the River Main into something he called the North German Confederation, with Prussia, naturally, in charge. Yet the unification process wasn't over. In the south, Württemberg, Baden, Hesse, Darmstadt, and most importantly of all, Bavaria, still held out. They still remained outside of Berlin's direct control. If he wanted to finish forging Germany, the Iron Chancellor would need one last war to force these states into his cold, metallic embrace. Luckily, events across the Rhine were about to ensure that war became all but inevitable. Alright, let's leave Bismarck to his scheming for just a moment and go meet today's other champion fighter. Like Prussia, France had gone through its own major upheavals since 1848. But while the German revolutions that year had fizzled out in Paris, that led to the ascent of a brand new emperor. Louis Napoleon was the nephew of OG Napoleon, a pompous, faintly ridiculous man who spent years trying to worm his way into power. But it had only been in 1848 that it actually succeeded, winning the post-revolution presidential election by running as a populist outsider who appeared all things to all people. Once he was in power, though, it became clear that the thing he actually was a classic authoritarian. In 1851, Louis Napoleon overthrew the government in a coup. Shortly after, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. It was the beginning of the Second French Empire. For the emperor's fans, it was also the beginning of France's return to greatness. Always a great power, France had been forced into a meeker role following the Napoleonic Wars. Under Louis Napoleon, though, it pursued a hyperactive foreign policy that brought win after win. There was the Crimean War, which saw France help slap the Russian bear onto its backside. The Second War of Italian Unification, which saw Louis Napoleon humiliate the Austrians and become guarantor of the Papal States. These wars didn't just restore French prestige and feelings of Gallic superiority, they also convinced Louis Napoleon that his army was the best on the planet, and he, a military leader, on par with his uncle. The thing was, the rest of the world actually seemed to agree. The Empire's army operated on a narrow conscription system with 7-year terms, resulting in a sizable military full of highly capable soldiers. By the mid-1860s, they were armed with cutting-edge tech like breech-loading chasspot rifles and the Mitrailleuse, a kind of early hand-cranked machine gun that could spit out 100 rounds in a minute. Even up-and-coming Prussia was wary of provoking the French in this era. Before the 7 Weeks' War, Bismarck sounded Louis Napoleon out about the whole venture. When the fighting was done, it was Paris that led the peace talks. In other words, France under Napoleon III wasn't some decrepit old man in soiled boxer shorts awkwardly trying to prove he can still fight the neighborhood yobs. It was a hard ass, and yet those who looked closely could see signs that power was fading. 1861 had seen France lead an invasion of Mexico, an invasion that had grown into overthrowing the government and establishing the Second Mexican Empire. By early 1867, though, the project had collapsed into a humiliating debacle. As a great European power, getting kicked in the nuts by a bunch of Mexican irregulars should have been a bit of a warning to Paris. But while the French turned a blind eye to their weaknesses, others were ready to take advantage. Others whose names rhymed with Bismarck. Prior to the 7 Weeks' War, Louis Napoleon had hinted to Bismarck that he might require something in return for neutrality. Bismarck, in turn, had hinted that the emperor could maybe take Luxembourg, then a part of the German Confederation. But when Louis Napoleon tried to make good on this promise in March of 1867, Bismarck was suddenly all like, "Bye, Luxembourg! I never agreed to that, you croissant-munching clown." Bismarck's very public slapping down of French ambitions both nearly led to a war and caused outrage in Paris. Here was this minor power of Prussia suddenly dictating what the mighty French could and couldn't do. Who did they think they were? Public opinion was inevitably inflamed. Over the next couple of years, marching across the Rhine and giving Prussia a bloody nose would become a national obsession. But of course, Prussia was no longer a minor power. It was now victorious in 2 significant wars with a battle-tested army and a seat at the head of the gigantic North German Confederation. The French might want to fight, but there was no longer any guarantee that the fight would go the way they wanted it to. While both the 1864 and 1866 wars had been about expanding Prussian influence, Bismarck had made sure that he had excuses for the fighting. In the Schleswig War, it had been a succession crisis. In 1866, it had been Austria's mismanagement of their recently annexed duchy. For the Franco-Prussian War, it would again be dynastic issues that lit the fuse. This time, they'd be centered on Spain. In 1868, Queen Isabella II was overthrown in a revolution. Rather than declare a republic, the Spanish revolutionaries started casting about for a new, less objectionable monarch. They settled on Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen. This would turn out to be a bit of a major issue. Leopold C was related to the Prussian royal family. With France already nervous about Prussia's growing power, the idea that Spain would also fall into Berlin's orbit was about as comfortable as a porcupine enema. So, when Leopold's candidacy was announced on July 3rd, 1870, Paris lost its shit. Under intense diplomatic pressure, Leopold was forced to withdraw, but that wasn't enough for the French, who wanted reassurances that Prussia would never try anything so tricky again. On the 13th, the French ambassador accosted Wilhelm I at the spa town of Bad Ems and basically demanded that he stop being such a penis. William refused, and that was that. Except, of course, it wasn't. The next day, an account of the meeting in Bad Ems landed on Bismarck's desk. Presumably, while sniggering like a naughty, moustached schoolboy, Bismarck edited it to make the French ambassador sound like a jerk and Wilhelm like he'd slapped the guy down. The result was that everyone, French or Prussian, who read the Ems dispatch came away convinced their country's honor had been grievously insulted. This was a major problem for Napoleon III because for the first time in his reign, he was forced to listen to public opinion. Back in 1869, Louis Napoleon had overseen his empire's freest ever elections. The result had been a near loss of control, forcing him to start paying serious attention to what the public actually wanted. And what the public wanted was a war. In Paris, the streets were filled with chants of "To Berlin," while Louis Napoleon and his council erred towards peace, failing to declare war might have caused a riot. Under this cloud, a vote of the Legislative Chamber was called on July the 15th. Overwhelmingly, the delegates voted for war. Not everyone was on board, though. Elderly statesman Adolphe Thiers called it madness, while the much younger Léon Gambetta abstained from voting. But they were in the minority, and on July the 19th, 1870, Paris declared the opening of the Franco-Prussian War. Even before fighting began, the effects could already be seen. With memories of the Napoleonic Wars still semi-fresh, the southern German states who'd held out against Bismarck finally crumbled. They agreed to fall into military alliance with the North German Confederation, an alliance that would set the stage for full unification. In France, meanwhile, Napoleon III was hoping to find allies of his own. After centuries of hostility, France and Austria had recently been tiptoeing toward a partnership, one that might include Italy. But the talks weren't as far along as Louis Napoleon believed. On July the 20th, both Italy and Austria declared their neutrality. Even so, most observers expected France to win. Aside from technological advantages, the French army was big and experienced. So confident was the emperor that he made himself commander of the armed forces. Yet Prussia had learned fast in its recent wars. Bismarck's army was now extremely well-trained, able to move like a well-oiled machine. Nearly 500,000 men could be raised at short notice. At the same time, their general staff, embodied in the Commander General Helmuth von Moltke, was at the cutting edge of professionalism. A group of men who approached war not like soldiers, but like skilled managers. Louis Napoleon didn't know it yet, but his men wouldn't be marching to Berlin. Instead, they'd be marching to a slaughterhouse. Although the peace wouldn't be signed until the spring of 1871, the Franco-Prussian War was effectively over before it even began. The Germans mobilized so fast that over 350,000 men were at the front before 3 weeks had elapsed, helped by the ingenious use of rail lines. The French army, by contrast, was like a slumbering old man raising himself off the sofa, yawning, scratching his balls before shuffling off to make coffee. Well, okay, it wasn't quite that bad, but compared to the efficient Prussian mobilization, it meant the French started at a serious disadvantage. It was a start that they'd never really recover from. Hostilities began on August the 4th. That day, some 70,000 combined German troops attacked the small French garrison at Wissembourg. With a force about 10 times smaller than their attackers, the French were easily defeated. But that was just the hors d'oeuvres, a little taste of the nightmare that was going to arrive 2 days later. The Battle of Worth was the moment the French finally realized the tricolor wouldn't be flying over Berlin anytime soon. The army under Marshal Patrice de McMahon was smashed, forcing a scrambled retreat. Alsace was abandoned to the advancing Germans, as was Lorraine. Suddenly, the focus was no longer on taking German territory, but on stopping any more of France falling to the onslaught. And speaking of German territory, now might be a good time to discuss the terms we're using here. The Franco-Prussian War is a bit of a misleading name, since while Prussia led the fighting, it was a combined force from both the German Confederation and the holdout states that allowed Bismarck to smash the Second French Empire. So it makes a bit more sense for me to say Germans when talking generally, and Prussians only when talking about actual Prussians. Got that? Good. Now back to watching France get humiliated. The next big decisive engagement came at Mar-le-Tour. There, on August the 16th, a bruising fight saw some 15,000 killed, countless more wounded, and Marshal Acquis Bizan sounding his army's retreat to the fortified town of Metz. Still, we don't want to give the impression that the war was completely one-sided. Throughout all this, the German forces suffered horribly too. Mar-le-Tour, for example, saw staggering casualties on the German side. Worse still, at the Battle of Gravelotte on August the 18th, the Prussians had their first horrific encounter with fast-firing French weaponry. In just 20 minutes, 8,000 Prussian Guard Corps were mowed down, a chilling preview of the carnage mechanized weapons would wreak in 1914. Still, the general tide of the war was clearly away from the French. By the end of August the 18th, Bazin and his army of the Rhine were effectively trapped in Metz. This was such a catastrophe that Marshal McMahon took his army to try and save them, accompanied by Louis Napoleon himself. Sadly, this heroic effort would only wind up piling catastrophe atop catastrophe. On August the 31st, the rescue party found themselves surrounded and cut off at the town of Sedan. As the sun rose the next morning, on the 1st September day of 1870, Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck took up positions on a nearby hill to watch the show. Below them, von Moltke's forces slowly advanced on the trapped French. And so began the war's greatest battle. When Louis Napoleon had launched his coup nearly 20 years earlier, he had done so on the same day, December the 2nd, that his famous uncle had been coronated emperor. This was the reason behind Karl Marx's withering quote that history repeats itself, the first as tragedy, then as a farce. But you could just as easily apply it to the end of Louis Napoleon's reign. The battle that closed Napoleon Le Petit's career was more a grim comedy than another Waterloo. The fighting began at 4 a.m. as Prussian troops broke through into the town where McMahon's forces were arranged near the citadel. At first, the fighting was gritty, troops battling it out house to house in a bloody war of attrition. But then McMahon was wounded at 7 a.m. and everything devolved into farce. Without a clear chain of succession, both General de Croo and General de Wimphem declared themselves interim commanders and issued contradictory orders. Amid this chaos, parts of the French army found itself following one set of commands while other parts followed the other. The result was grand confusion, not helped by the French having forgotten to bring any maps. Before long, units were heading off in the wrong direction or stumbling into the line of artillery fire, or just generally milling around looking lost. His men completely in disarray. General de Wimphen failed to notice the Prussians catching them in a pincer movement until it was too late. Once it became clear they were trapped, what discipline remained in the French lines evaporated. With artillery shells falling like deadly raindrops, the troops stampeded for the safety of the fortress. Amid an undignified crush, many were killed. At 6 p.m., Louis Napoleon acknowledged the inevitable. He sent Wilhelm a message which simply read, "Not having been able to die in the midst of my troops, it only remains for me to place my sword in your majesty's hands." The next day, Bismarck met the emperor for an unconditional surrender. 80,000 French troops were taken prisoner, along with Louis Napoleon. When word reached Paris of the debacle at Sedan, the reaction against the emperor was swift and brutal. On September the 4th, a bloodless coup overthrew the remnants of the Second French Empire. Napoleon III was stripped of his title and a government of national defense named in his place. Despite the name, though, no one really expected the government to do much defending. The combined German armies were now marching toward Paris. The emperor was a prisoner. It was over. The French had lost. Even the new government expected to do little more than oversee a surrender. The foreign minister, Jules Favre, was dispatched to offer Bismarck terms, including a large indemnity payment of 200 million francs. But it turns out Favre had misjudged the situation. Rather than negotiate, Bismarck demanded Alsace and Lorraine as the price of peace, a demand so outrageous he might as well have asked for Favre to throw in a dirty night with his grandmother. Insulted, Favre ended negotiations. It was a decision that would seal Paris's fate. Heavily fortified since the 1840s, Paris was surrounded by 33 kilometers of walls, all over 10 meters high, and supported by 16 forts. Basically, it was like an Attack on Titan's Tross district, so secure that only a colossal titan could ever hope to break in. So the Germans didn't even try. Instead, they encircled the city, a vast unbroken line that completely cut Paris off from the world. As they approached, villagers from nearby fled inside the French capital's gates, swelling the population. All the farm animals were brought in, 80 days worth of food for the entire city stockpiled. Finally, on September the 19th, General Leonhard von Blumenthal's forces completed their encirclement of the city of lights. The capital was now isolated. The siege of Paris had begun. For those of us living in the hyper-connected 21st century, it's impossible to truly grasp just how utterly cut off Paris was in the autumn of 1870. With radio not yet a thing, there was simply no way for news to get in, no way for information to pass through the German lines. Well, almost, because if there's one thing everyone knows about the siege of Paris, it's the balloons. Barely had the siege begun than guys like Felix Nader and Gaston Tissandier were undertaking reckless missions to fly giant bags of mail over the German lines to keep some form of open communication. But it wasn't just letters the balloonists smuggled out. On October the 7th, the new government minister for war, Leon Gambetta, was flown safely into the French countryside. There, he succeeded in raising guerrilla armies to fight the invaders, opening up a whole new front in the Loire Valley with his francs-tireurs. But while their attacks would startle the Prussians, they wouldn't change the direction of the war. In response to these tactics, Prussian soldiers began executing prisoners, burning down villages where the francs-tireurs hid. Although Gambetta would fight on for 2 months, by December his forces would have been defeated. Meanwhile, the larger war was going from bad to worse. On October the 27th, the army, still stuck in Metz, surrendered, annihilating any hopes Parisians had of them breaking out and lifting the siege. Not long after, the capital's food stockpiles ran out. On top of that, a bone-chillingly cold winter set in. As people's bellies emptied and their faces numbed in the bitter frost, they began to turn to more and more creative sources of energy. First, the city's horses were killed and eaten, then the zoo animals, then the cats and the dogs. Finally, people were left dining on rats, and that's if they were lucky. For the working class of Paris, even rat meat was unaffordable, a meal that had once been for the lowest of the low, now transformed into an unreachable luxury by the cold logic of market forces. It was into this starving, miserable situation that the first shells began to fall. From the moment Paris had been surrounded, Bismarck had advocated bombardment, but the other commanders had been horrified. Surely the city would surrender regardless. By December, though, the war had dragged on so long that all earlier qualms were forgotten. Just before New Year's Eve, the first German shells landed on the City of Lights. But this turned out to be just the test drive. Starting on the 5th of January 1871, hundreds of shells were dropped on Paris every single night, crashing down at sunset and not letting up until dawn. All told, 12,000 would hit the capital, but their physical effects would be minimal. Since the Germans didn't use explosive shells and fired when the streets were mostly empty, only 97 were killed in the entire month of shelling. Psychologically, though, it was hell. A grueling, relentless slog through an awful winter. And it was about to get even worse. That month, the last remnants of the French army finally surrendered. On January the 19th, the Parisians tried to break the siege one last time. 100,000 armed men marched out to free the city, but they were beaten back, raw and defeated. 4 days later, the government of national defense secretly contracted Bismarck to discuss an armistice. In return for Paris's surrender and the army's disarming, the Iron Chancellor agreed to lift the siege. Paris surrendered on January the 27th, 1871, after 4 awful months in which some 50,000 had died. True to his word, Bismarck immediately let food and supplies come through, but then he could afford to be magnanimous. He already had what he wanted. Back in November, the remaining southern states had at last agreed to join a united Germany. The new German Empire was proclaimed on January the 18th at Versailles. Finally, Bismarck had forged in blood and iron the state the liberals of 1848 had only been able to dream of building. With the fighting over, weary, broken France held elections for a new government to negotiate the peace. Headed by Adolphe Thiers, it effectively agreed to end the war at any cost. And what a cost it was. France was forced to surrender Alsace and most of Lorraine and pay an eye-watering indemnity of 5 billion francs. You probably remember learning about the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, about how crushingly, humiliatingly unfair it was towards Germany. Well, this is the reason why. In 1918, France was out for revenge over this 1871 humiliation, and that, in turn, set the course for the next cycle of violence, for the grievances that would fuel the rise of an angry little man with a silly moustache who promised to make Germany powerful again. But that's a story you already know. The Treaty of Frankfurt officially ended the war on May 10, 1871. By that time, Paris had risen in insurrection, establishing the revolutionary Paris Commune. But the Thiers government quickly, brutally crushed them. With the annihilation of the Commune, the Franco-Prussian War reached its final end. In the here and now, with 150 years of hindsight, it's hard to overstate just how important this semi-obscure conflict was. It was the capture of Louis Napoleon at Sedan that led to Italy's final act of unification, as the French guarantee of the Papal States' autonomy evaporated, allowing Italy to annex Rome. It was the early Prussian victories that made German high command so obsessed with quick mobilization in the event of war, a key link in the destructive chain that made World War I blow up so big, so quick. Then, of course, there's Germany itself, first forged in this furnace of war, with different borders now, but still a political unit that survives to this very day. However you look at it then, it's hard not to agree that this one short war changed the destiny of Europe. While it may not be as well known as some others on this channel, it certainly remains a piece of history that's worth remembering. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.